It's Tuesday, the 1st of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, Labour MP Angela Eagle, Associate Editor of the Financial Times Stephen Bush, and Emily Carver from the free market think tank the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today.
Well, I think in this job you do have to choose your language carefully.
That from the Immigration Minister after the Home Secretary said this yesterday.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast.
Labour weren't impressed.
The Home Secretary has come to the House today and announced to us that the immigration system is broken. Can she tell us who's been in power for the last 12 years?
Remember this?
This country will not be able to tax its way to growth.
After the death of Trussonomics, is the high-tax Chancellor about to become a higher-tax Prime Minister?
I pay about £1,500 a month, which is more than my mortgage.
Childcare, how can its costs be reduced and availability increased? Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock enters the jungle and loses the Conservative whip. More of that later on in the programme, but let's start with the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. You saw her there in the headlines, putting in a pretty robust, fiery performance in the House of Commons yesterday, using that word and her determination to stop what she called the invasion of small boat crossings over the Channel and to the South Coast. Now, was the word invasion the right word to use? Miriam?
Well, clearly, we do have to be very sensitive about the language that we use. And as Robert Jenrick said, it's very important to be sensitive and compassionate on what is a very difficult issue. But it's easy to pick out one word that Suella used in an hour of statement yesterday after 3 or 4 days of what can only be described as hounding in the press and focus on that rather than concentrating on the real issue, which is, as she said, that our immigration system is broken. We've got extreme problems with border security. And our system is so overwhelmed, actually, that true asylum seekers are not getting processed quickly enough and not getting the care that they deserve.
And is that the sort of rhetoric you would use, Miriam?
Well, you can call it rhetoric, you can say it was unwise in retrospect.
Well, what do you think?
But I think she is being hounded in the press. And I switched on the Today programme yesterday, and I'm afraid I am one of the 500,000 listeners that they've mostly lost in the last year. And there's half an hour of focus on her personally, on her as a person, on what a terrible job she's apparently doing. And an avoidance of the issue. And I think this is what this is, actually. It's an avoidance of the true issue here, of a serious situation that desperately needs sorting out.
Angela, is that the right sort of word to use for what is a very serious issue and Miriam feels isn't getting the attention it deserves in the right way?
I think it's been done deliberately by the Home Secretary to distract away from the fact that she is failing to do the basics in her job, not only failing on national security grounds with what we heard about the emails, not only failing to get the immigration system under control, but actually floundering around. She's a bad Home Secretary, and she wants to create a diversion to divert away from the fact that she's saying the system is broken. Who's been in power for the last 12 years? Who's broken it? Why isn't she fixing it? Why is she indulging in this distraction? Why do 96% of last year's arrivals by boat still haven't been processed? Why does it take so long for the Home Office to deal with a basic issue? And, you know, this is what she's doing. It's populism and it's dangerous rhetoric.
Right, you think it's dangerous rhetoric?
Yeah,
I mean, we did the figures. Well, we did the figures yesterday.
There was an attack on the immigration centre by somebody who threw 3 firebombs at it, and she she's using incendiary language. It's not the behaviour that you'd expect from a responsible Home Secretary.
What word would you use, Angela? Because if you look at the numbers, we did some of the statistics yesterday. The number of people who have made that dangerous crossing in small boats is just under 40,000 for the year to date. The year before, I think it was about 24,500. In the pandemic, it was far, far lower. If not an invasion, what would you say it was?
Look, I think it's a problem that they haven't been solving, because to solve it, you need to work cross-border and you need to work in cooperation with the French, the Belgians, our European partners. And instead of rowing with them, which is what the ERG and the faction of the Tory party that Suella Braverman comes from have been doing and throwing blame around, you actually have to do the hard graft of making the system work and coming to agreements. And that is where she and many of her other ministerial colleagues have failed.
Well, I think that the Home Office and the government have tried exceptionally hard to work with the French and European partners over the year. And I think this year alone, in partnership with the French, we've stopped 28,000 people arriving on the shores. Yes, 40,000 have arrived, but 28,000 have been prevented from coming. But again, I think this detracts from the wider issue. We have a global migrant crisis. You know, we have become a target for criminal gangs across the world. That is true. And our system is simply being overwhelmed. And I accept the criticism of the Home Office not processing people quick enough, but it is simply a function of the sheer numbers of people that are arriving on our shores. And I think, just to the point on populism, of course we should not be using incendiary language. But we also need to be in touch with the genuine concerns of ordinary people who do see illegal immigration and insecure borders as a serious issue.
Is that language using the word invasion and other language, actually, that Suella Braverman has used when discussing this issue around the deportation of migrants, for example, is that appropriate?
No, I mean, look, invasion is what is happening in Ukraine. It is not an appropriate form of words to use about a group of people, 70% of whom are eventually, when their application processes through this incredibly slow process, given the right to stay here. But it's not an appropriate use of language for people who simply want to make a better life for themselves. And also, I think politically, given the government's struggles to get to grips with the issue, I don't think it's very wise from a Conservative self-interest perspective for the Home Secretary to be talking in quite such lurid language about something that her department is clearly failing to tackle.
What do you think, Emily?
I think the situation has changed, and while I wouldn't have used the word invasion, particularly considering the fact that there was a firebombing at the migrant processing centre in Dover, the strength of feeling among large proportions of the public is very strong. And I feel like many people feel that they are being gaslit, because they're being told that all of the people attempting to make this crossing are asylum seekers, refugees. Let's have a look at the stats and look at what the Home Office officials are actually saying. Tony Smith, the former Director General of the UK Board Force, he says the cohort coming through at the moment contain dangerous criminal elements. 12,000 out of the 38,000 this year are Albanians. This is putting unprecedented strain on our asylum system. So I think we need to be honest about how the demographics of those coming over is changing and how some people are simply trying to escape the system as quickly as they can. You know, as the clandestine channel threat commander at the Home Office said, many don't even wish to follow through with the asylum process. They're put in a hotel and then they disappear. I think everyone has a right to be worried about this. And what really annoys me, actually, is that there are politicians, Conservative MPs, for example, David Davis, who voted against the Rwanda policy for moral reasons. He's now campaigning against having asylum seekers resident in hotels in his constituency. So you've got to get behind a policy if you want this to matter to change. But I do think that also saying Suella Braverman can't do anything about this, she is being hamstrung in many ways. You have charities, legal campaigners, all having different legal challenges against the Rwanda policy. Then you obviously have the European Court to deal with as well. So there's so many challenges.
Well, let me let the others respond. Angela, what do you say to that?
I think, firstly, when you're Home Secretary, you have to go according to the law, or other Home Secretaries have done it. And if you have to change the law if that's not working, I think it's important. Everybody wants our borders to be controlled appropriately, and they want a system that allows genuine asylum seekers, of which many of these people are, It's no good portraying them all as Albanian criminals.
No, but the cohort
which is
has
what
changed.
You've
The
just
demographics
done.
Well, it's a recent development.
These things happen and it needs to be monitored. So they need to come to proper arrangements. They need to get the National Crime Agency to work to deal with the criminal gangs in cooperation with other countries where these people are coming from. None of that's happening because Suella Braverman and these entire Tory governments, we've had 3 iterations of them in the last 4 weeks, are too busy staring at their own navels to actually make anything run in the country.
I mean, and Stephen have a point, Miriam, that actually what Suella Braverman could be doing is highlighting the very issue that Conservative governments had failed to grip, despite making the issue of small boat crossings such a central part of their campaigns, their manifestos, and yet nothing has changed. It's actually got worse, whether it's been under Priti Patel, Grant Shapps very briefly, and now Suella Braverman. No flights have gone to Rwanda. Small boat crossings continue under Conservative governments.
Well, I think that's absolutely what she did say yesterday in Parliament. She admitted that it's a crisis, that we're not sorting it out properly, that we have failed in many ways, obviously, to get a grip on this. And I think she's also spoken in the past about the way that legal challenges are brought that abuse some laws that were there for good reason to protect vulnerable people that are now being abused and that are preventing us from sorting out this problem. This is not a problem that can be solved overnight. But I do think that Suella Braverman has a grip on both the law and the issues at hand to deal with this. But let's not forget, she's been in post for 2 months. We cannot blame 40,000...
out of post and then in post again.
But in total, for less than 2 months, we cannot blame Suella Braverman for 40,000 people arriving on our shores illegally. It's a much bigger problem than can be solved in a couple of weeks.
Should you just admit, both of you, as MPs, that actually it's an impossible problem? I mean, it seems to be an intractable problem to solve.
No problems are impossible, but you have to get a grip on your department. You have to cooperate with other people and other organisations from other countries to try to drive the criminal gangs out of existence. And unfortunately, this government is too busy throwing brickbats at Europe to cooperate with it.
Finally.
It is an impossible problem to solve if we don't reduce the numbers of people arriving on our shores. It's just too big a problem. The only way we can do that is to have a proper deterrent to stop criminal gangs exploiting this issue.
Is there also a sense, Stephen, finally on this, that actually the sort of language, the sort of discussion around this subject does to some extent mean there is a possibility for Rishi Sunak, because of all the economic difficulties which we're just about to talk about, that they might win on the culture wars, if we call it that more broadly?
So I don't think that does work when you're a government with a large majority. It worked previously because up until this Parliament, I think the Conservative Party had a good argument that it was having its hands tied. But I think at this point, if the Conservatives can't show real progress, people will quite reasonably go, mate, we gave you an 80-seat majority. If there's a problem with immigration in this country, that is solely a problem of the Conservatives.
Right, let's have a look at the economic situation and show you a couple of the front pages. The Daily Telegraph says sweeping tax rises on rough road ahead, and this is the front page of the Daily Express. Dire warning, higher tax on way to plug debt. As you know, it was supposed to be yesterday, the Halloween statement. It was postponed to give Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt a little more time, perhaps to bring down some of the cost, the size of the black hole. It'll now be on the 17th of November and accompanied by forecasts by the Office for Budget Responsibility, which, of course, were missing for the mini-budget on the 23rd of September. So the Telegraph has reported that Jeremy Hunt is looking at saving money in a ratio of 50% for tax rises and 50% spending cuts. Where would the split be for you, Miriam?
Well, I wouldn't want to have to make that decision.
Thankfully you don't, but you could tell us where you think that should fall.
I think that is the Chancellor's job, isn't it? To look at all the data, to look at the books, to confer with the Treasury and work out where is that sweet spot. I mean, let's be honest, these are going to be very, very tough decisions. We're in very difficult economic times, as is a lot of the Western world, and there are no easy options. And I think the line that the Chancellor's got to walk is to acknowledge that this black hole has to be filled, that we cannot debt fund, as was tried said in the mini budget, but at the same time protecting the most vulnerable and trying not to push the economy deeper into recession.
Right.
It's a very difficult line.
Well, indeed. Where would you put that division, Angela, between tax rises and spending cuts?
Well, I mean, we're in a situation where there's a 50 billion hole, we think, being blown in the public finances because of the fantasy-based idiocy that the IEA and other organisations encouraged Liz Truss to participate in, which a mistake which we're all going to be paying for years to come. Now, when the Tories last did an austerity budget, they did 80% public spending cuts and 20% tax rises, and that meant that they've left the public services in a very parlous state. So I don't know what they're going to do come the 17th.
But I'm asking what you would do, because you didn't like the 80% 20% split, which, as you say, mainly came from spending cuts. Labour's proposals at the time, we don't have to go over them again, but they weren't that dissimilar. But anyway, for now, would you then put more on tax rises?
We'll have to wait and see what the size of the budget is. You have to see what actually can be afforded. What the Telegraph is talking about at the moment, for example, is that public sector workers will have a 2% pay rise, so-called, next year. That would leave them with 2.5 this year, about 8% a year, real terms pay cuts. And we know that many people are leaving the public sector, the healthcare, the social care sector, because they can earn more money in other jobs and they can't afford the very high rates of inflation.
Well, let's just pick up on some of those things that Angela has rightly pointed to in terms of what's being trailed in the papers. The Times has said public sector workers face 2% pay rise in a bid to balance the books. Far less than the private sector, I think, is running at about 7%. These things would happen next year.
But none of these pay rises, so to speak, are real terms rises. They are all pay cuts when you take account of the fact that inflation is 10.1%.
You would be in favour of much bigger pay rises.
And food inflation is 15%.
Yes, so you would be in favour of much bigger rises then in the public sector?
You have to look to see what the balance is and the fairness is, and we don't know what those circumstances are until we see the OBR report.
Where do you think the split should be?
Well, my colleague Martin Sandbu works out that if you solely balance it with tax cuts, you are still actually fairly near the bottom of the OECD. Tax rises. Yeah. You're still actually fairly near the bottom of the OECD in terms of the overall tax burden. We've had a decade of largely public spending cuts. We have a very, very good labour market if you're an employee. You can choose what you have, so I think it's unlikely that 2% pay rise is going to be something the Treasury is going to stick to. And when you consider the various demands voters have of the Conservatives on immigration, on crime, on schools, I don't think it is practical, even before we get into the social harm, for the government to even be doing an 80-20%. I think most of this is going to have to be tax rises. I think Rishi Sunak's going to have to do what he did in his last budget, where he very sensibly said, look, I'm going to raise taxes and raise spending.
Right, and he was a high-taxing Chancellor. He probably is going to be a high-taxing Prime Minister. Are you happy with that, that it should really come from tax rises?
No, I don't know what the balance exactly should be. One would have to look at the numbers, but it does seem to me that we need to remember why we're in this position. The government, of course, borrowed £370 billion over the course of the pandemic. They've borrowed £1.4 trillion since 2001. We live beyond our means continuously for decades, well, 2 decades, in fact.
So was Angela right when she said that the Institute...
at our desk now.
Yeah, but was Angela right when she talked about the Institute of Economic Affairs, where you are based, that actually that was then the wrong time to have advised a Prime Minister on the idea of tax cuts, which, of course, then did spook the markets, and we are in a worse financial situation than we would have been.
Yeah, I mean, free market organisations like the Institute of Economic Affairs have advised for many years that the tax burden has been too high and that there are areas where red tape and regulation should be cut. That is an overall vision. That does not mean
Well, let her finish the sentence and then you can come back.
That does not mean that the Prime Minister's mini-budget was based on some policy manifesto that the IEA or any other free market institution...
You did advise them.
She surrounded herself with advisors from the IEA. You were all cock-a-hoop after the mini-budget about how fantastic it was. The Telegraph, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail were all saying, at last, a Conservative budget. But your fantasy-based, faith-based economics actually crashed our economy. They crashed the economy. It exploded on landing. And the £50 billion hole that your ideas blew in our national budget is what we are all now going to have to pay for. So I don't know why you would come on programmes like this and continue to push the same rubbish.
I'm sorry, what am I continuing to push? I didn't even support Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
But the
get your facts right.
But the IEA did. The IEA did, Emily. But ask the question that you were posing.
Many people at the IEA welcomed a shift towards a lower tax economy.
That worked well.
Yes.
That worked well,
Many people who advised the Prime Minister were ignored when it came to the impact that moving too fast and too quickly would be on the financial markets. It was up to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng only to decide what policies they put before the House of Commons. So do not pretend that
not you personally, but your organisation. And we don't know where your funding comes from in the IEA either. That's another top secret.
Can you pinpoint one area where you would raise taxes or cut spending?
Listen,
because you've completely ignored that question.
Answer that question, Angela, then I'm going to go to Miriam.
Well, Rachel Reeves has said that we will take the non-dom status away, for example, to raise money.
Hang on,
no, it's not
hang on.
It's £3 billion. You might not think it's a pittance, but it's not a pittance. There's all sorts of ways of raising money, which our Shadow Chancellor will bring to the table at the appropriate time.
Well, let me just show you this tweet from Tim Montgomery along these lines. A massive moment. This was at the time of the mini-budget for IEA London. They've been advocating these policies, the tax-cutting policies, for years. They incubated Truss and Kwarteng during their early years as MPs. Britain is now their laboratory. Well, of course, no longer. Things have moved apace. Do you think, Miriam, that actually the Institute of Economic Affairs, the people that work there, the ideas that they proposed, led your party astray?
Well, obviously, I wasn't party to discussions at the top of government, but I think it's a mischaracterisation of the mini-budget to say that it was the IEA's dream. Let's not forget, the biggest spending commitment of the mini-budget was this energy price guarantee.
But that had already happened before the mini-budget. I will let you finish, but we need to say that those plans had already been published. I mean, they may have not had a precise price tag, but we knew they were about £100 billion, Miriam, and it was the market reacting to what was announced on the mini-budget.
To the gap between income and expenditure of the government. The biggest part of that was this energy price guarantee that is hugely expensive and has widespread political support. But I think Emily's right. The mini-budget, whilst it absolutely was a political mistake and was very regrettable in hindsight, what it did was highlight some very deep-seated structural economic issues that we have in this country, which are the fact that we have been debt-funded, we have a regionally imbalanced economy, and we've used the City of London to basically prop up the regions. And once inflation kicks in, once international energy prices that are beyond our control start to rise, we realise that we can no longer debt finance our economy. And the mini-budget, I'm afraid, highlighted that. And now we've got some very, very serious work to do. Yes, mistakes were made, but let's not pretend that that caused the problems that are decades old.
Where is growth going to come from? I mean, even if we're looking at a budget statement, whatever we want to call it, coming up in a couple of weeks' time that's going to take all the figures into the account, they will still want to find economic growth. Where will it come from?
Well, if you look at the Bank of England forecasts and what is likely to be in the OBR, we'll have to wait and see. It looks like we're going to have a recession before we have any growth.
Yeah, so where would Labour look for growth?
What I'm saying is they have made all of this much more difficult by the errors that they have made.
And I think we can sort of broadly accept that.
And the fantasy economics that they've pursued. So what you've got to look at is the fact that we need a green transformation in this country. We've got to
That's going to add to borrowing before you actually get money from it.
You invest to create growth, and there are ways of doing that. If we're going to reach net zero in the appropriate time and help contribute to saving the planet, we have a major retooling job to do in this country. We've done it before as a country. We can do it again. That would create very many thousands of jobs and begin to kickstart a move in the right direction to move us away from a failing model to one that's fit for the future.
To some extent, it's history, very recent history, what happened in the mini-budget and the reversal by Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor. Does it mean that we've gone back to Treasury orthodoxy?
Well, yes, in lots of ways it does, right? It shows that, broadly speaking, our current understanding of how economic policy works was about right. We know that there is some capacity to borrow, mostly for long-term investment. We've had it demonstrated that you cannot go, don't worry, I'm going to borrow to spend day to day, and trust me, my plan is growth will magically come from the ether. But it is in a much more difficult context, right? In every other previous version of this debate, the Conservative Party has been able to point to an economic record that has broadly been seen as fairly good by most voters. And now they're in this very difficult position of having to explain these very painful cuts, or these very painful tax rises, or a combination of the two, while at the same time being not only the people at the wheel of the car, but the people who crashed the car and are now sort of having to say, look, trust us, we may have crashed this, but don't worry, we're the people still to keep on the road.
Yeah, Miriam, how are you going to do that to your constituents?
Well, clearly, you know, the global and national economics is hard to explain. You know, I don't dispute that. But I do think it's important to draw on, you know, the 2 or 3 decades of difficulties in our economy. And I think, of course, Tory MPs are always calling for tax rises. Everybody would prefer to have low taxes. Of course, sorry, I do apologise. I'm going to be in trouble for that. Of course, Tory MPs are always calling for tax cuts. And in an ideal world, of course, we'd have a low tax. But actually, the popular position amongst voters is fair taxes. And I think that's what we should be.
What does that mean?
It means that people pay according to their means. And I think we've got some serious issues in this country.
Should we be singing the red flag next?
Oh, no, I will
not go that far. Might be a little way to go before that happens.
And you know, the reason that expenditure is high and taxes are high is because the demand on the state is high. Yeah. There are all sorts of reasons for that. You know, people needing the health service, people have family breakdown, all these kind of reasons. We need to look at the social demand on the state before we can just say we can cut taxes and we don't need the state.
Well, is this one route? Let's have a look. BBC breaking news. BP reports £7.1 billion quarterly profit, more than double the amount it made at this time last year due to high oil and gas prices. Should they stop resisting a further levy, a further windfall tax on these enormous profits, which would help at least plug that gap?
I do think it should be seriously looked at again. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. We're going to talk about childcare in a minute. That's almost double the national childcare budget. That is an enormous amount of money. And I think in really difficult times like this, of course, there are arguments about not putting off investment. But I think when you look at figures like that, the cuts that we're going to have to make, yes, absolutely, we should look again.
Emily, do you agree?
I don't think it would touch the sides of the energy bill subsidy costs.
But would it be worth doing?
I don't particularly think that it would be good in the medium to long term. I think it would impact investment. I think it would have negative consequences. I think it's a populist measure that everyone wants is popular in the country, that's for sure. But I'm not sure that in reality it would reap much dividends. But I would just say one very quickly is that one of the major reasons that people got behind Liz Truss wasn't the tax cuts. It was because she spoke about supply-side reform, planning reform, etc.
Except for Tory MPs weren't behind them.
These things shouldn't be thrown out. Planning reform is one of those things that needs to be done to get things built in this country, be it renewables or housing.
Are you disappointed that Miriam looks as if she might be going down the track of a windfall tax, a further windfall tax on oil and gas producers?
I can see why she would. It's a popular policy. It's a popular policy in the polling, but I don't think it will reap the dividends that we think it will.
These supply-side reforms, these reforms to planning that Emily has mentioned, and we're going to talk about childcare in just a moment, childcare reform. The problem with it, as far as I can see, is that a lot of Tory MPs are against them.
Yeah, look, that's essentially the big problem, right? Liz Truss talked about an anti-growth coalition, which spreads across all of politics, but its biggest and most powerful component, unfortunately, is Conservative backbenchers who have voted against planning reform once in this Parliament. Rishi Sunak, looking at the very difficult inheritance he has basically gone, I'm not going anywhere near planning reform. You must be mental if you think I'm going to touch that. But that does mean if you're not... Look, if you do not have a supply-side approach to get growth, if you've cut yourself off from your biggest, nearest market, if you can't build housing, if you're saying that you're not allowed to have onshore renewables, then you very rapidly, when you have, exactly as Miriam says, an ageing population, there are loads of reasons why the demand on the state is going up. That is a secular trend. If you don't have a growth strategy, you do get into difficulty very quickly.
Right. During the Conservative Party conference, Miriam, we asked a number of Conservative MPs about this divide between what they say in public when it comes to planning reform and what they say in private. If you have a planning application come before you in the future, will you stand there and not object to it, which is what we found? They wanted liberalisation of planning, and then in private they had objected to any house building or any planning application that had gone ahead of them.
Well, I think this is not a particular issue in my constituency. We've got a lot of brownfield that's being developed with broadly public support. Of course, there's the odd piece of greenbelt that people want to protect. But I think more broadly, I absolutely agree for the need for reform. I think an awful lot of our problems, social and economic, can be placed at the door of housing that is far too expensive and there's not enough supply. And I don't think we did actually vote against it. I think it was taken off the table before the chance.
Because they thought they would lose.
But it's not, let's be honest, it's not just Conservative MPs, it's also local councils that don't want to deliver big developments in their patch. So there does need to be a national policy. We need to be a bit more clever about it as well. It's not just lack of supply, although that is an issue. Historically low interest rates have massively inflated the price of assets. Well, property has become an asset. And that's also been a problem, something that we could perhaps tackle differently.
Well, just briefly then on assets. We've had a couple of Labour MPs talk about the need for wealth taxes now, that would be, or asset taxes, that would be where they would try and bring in more revenue, apart from taxing the well-paid or the best-paid. Would you be supportive of that, Angela?
Well, the Treasury Select Committee, of which I'm a member, had a look at this and got as far as not ruling it out, and that's got a Conservative majority on it. So I think that you've got to look, maybe wealth taxes work at their best if they're one-off, much like the windfall taxes that can help kickstart development when there've been unearned and unexpected super profits.
All right, well, let's have a look at these mums actually here who were on something called a March of the Mummies at the weekend, urging the government for reforms to childcare. Let's have a listen.
I pay about £1,500 a month, which is more than my mortgage. If we don't find work, we go into debt to pay childcare.
We can't do certain things. We've put on hold having a second baby because we just couldn't afford to send 2 children into childcare, and that doesn't seem something that we should be having to decide.
Miriam, you've contributed to a report by the Centre for Social Justice about childcare. What did you think was the problem?
Well, it's a landmark report because it's actually asking parents what they want out of the childcare budget, the subsidy that government puts towards childcare every year, which totals about £4 billion across all the different schemes. And actually it finds that parents don't want just more free hours or more free nursery subsidy. They actually want control over how they use that money and how they use it to pay for childcare. So there's this assumption in this country, and there has been for a decade or more, that the answer to childcare is more cheap formal childcare. But that's not actually what parents want. And this survey shows that most parents would prefer to spend more time with their own babies and young children, more time looking after their own children, but are not able to because of financial pressures. And our whole childcare budget at the moment, which is complicated and many people don't understand their entitlements, and for many people it's not flexible enough, gears parents towards going back to work as quickly as possible. That isn't the case in many countries, and I don't think it's best for children.
Do you agree, Angela?
Well, I think parents should be able to choose and be facilitated to spend time with their children if they want to, but also go back to work. And that's a kind of choice that if you decide that you're not going to provide childcare or it's going to be too expensive, people don't have. So I think it's important to think about how you can enable parents, men and women, by the way, to make that choice. At the moment, clearly, the childcare system in this country is far too expensive. It's driving a lot of women actually back out of the labour market now because they cannot afford, in the aftermath of the pandemic, where costs have gone up, to put their children into childcare. That's going to have huge impacts if we don't sort it out. So I think the Labour Party's talked about, for example, having free breakfast clubs across the country for everyone who wishes to ensure that their children can go into education properly fed and they can get to work and not have to worry about dropping off kids.
I'm going to get you to respond and say what you want to say to this graph, Miriam, because this actually shows the number of hours that women with children work when they have children. You can see along the bottom there, the dotted line, you can see the drop-off of hours worked by women. Men, on the other hand, since Angela mentioned both men and women when it comes to childcare, their hours barely drop off at all when they have children. Is that a problem?
But why are we assuming that a measure of success is how many hours women with children work.
I'm not assuming it, but is that, you don't think that's a problem? That's fine.
The survey shows that the vast majority of parents would like to spend more time with their young children. That is what parents want. 50% of parents would like to do all of the caring for their children themselves, them or their partner, but only 19% are actually able to do this. And the problem with our current childcare policy is that it has one driver, and that's to get parents back into work and increase the GDP. But that's not what families want, and it's not what's best for children. So the proposal is to amalgamate all this money that's spent on childcare and give parents this kind of family credits, this ability to choose where that money goes. Yes, to use it on formal childcare if that's what's best for the family, to use it on family childcare, informal childcare, to stay at home yourself. It's about choice.
Is that a problem, that women will do less work, stay at home more, and perhaps be encouraged to do so by the state?
Well, in a large part, that chart is the product of the fact that our childcare policy doesn't work very well. The average family, the second earner, which usually is the woman, their income is solely swallowed up by childcare costs. So lots of couples, not unreasonably, go, this ain't worth the candle. So that chart is a big problem because of what drives it. However, we do have a problem that our childcare policy is trying to do about 3 different things. It's trying to give children the best start in life, it's trying to force parents back into the workplace, and it's trying to solve the gender pay gap. And the problem is it's not really doing any of those things very well. I think the thing which is very useful about this report, it's only 28 pages, I strongly urge viewers to read it, is it takes a very strong ideological position about what it wants to do. And the big problem we've had in the last decade is really there hasn't been a guiding mind on childcare policy. So we spend a lot of money, we spend the OECD average, we do not get the OECD average in terms of results.
I mean, is the real problem that actually people can't afford to work, which is what you heard to some extent from people, Emily, because it may be cheaper almost to stay at home and look after your children, even if you wanted to go back to work?
Yes, speaking to women, I don't have children myself, but women with children who are, you know, below the age of 5, really, they do struggle to make that decision because essentially handing over half of your salary or more even on the childcare doesn't make sense really when you take into account that you're missing time with your children. But I would say the government should also, I think it's a great report giving more power to parents to decide what they want for their families. I think there's this idea sometimes pushed upon women that they all want the same thing, which isn't the case at all, that families do either. But I do think some of the regulations also could be had a look at as well. The childcare ratios, do we need a national curriculum for all under 5s? That sort of thing is making the cost of childcare much more expensive.
Angela, you were looking sceptical.
Well, I think that we have to have standards if young children are going to be left in a system that's essentially a private system. There have to be standards, and it's important actually that
like
parents know that they can leave their children in a safe environment where they're going to have proper access to very, very early years development.
Well, I think this is about focusing on the right things, and we have so much evidence to show that in the first 2 years of life particularly, how important that strong bond is for a baby to form with usually its mother, but its primary caregiver, and how important that time is. But at the moment, we have a total policy gap between the age of 6 months, when normally maternity pay runs out, and 3 years when the free childcare offer, as inadequate as it is, kicks in. And actually, this isn't a pro-children family, it's not a pro-children policy, it's not a pro-family policy, it's not a pro-women policy. And we need to refocus it about what's best for families and parents and not what's best for GDP.
We're going to talk about something a little different at the end of the programme. The Sun has this headline: I'm a celeb MP. Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, set to join I'm a Celebrity lineup in Australia as he's revealed as surprise extra campmate. He has, as a result, if I can show you this tweet from my colleague Nick Eardley, Chief Whip Simon Hart, following a conversation with Matt Hancock, I have considered the situation and believe this is a matter serious enough to warrant suspension of the whip with immediate effect. Is it right, Miriam, for a serving MP who draws a salary paid for by the public to appear on programmes like I'm a Celebrity? Would you do it?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely not. For all sorts of reasons, I wouldn't do it. But no, it's clearly wrong to do that while Parliament is sitting. I mean, what he chooses to use his recess for is a matter for him. But Parliament is sitting. We're elected to serve our constituents. That's the job we're there to do. And I read one report that he said something about it's important to highlight the issues that he's passionate about.
Dyslexia campaign,
well,
yes.
What are we in Parliament for, if not to highlight important issues?
Well, apparently 12 million people watch I'm a Celebrity, perhaps a few more million than go to Westminster Hall debates. I don't know. Angela,
I don't know how many people are watching our debates in Westminster Hall.
Not precisely, but you can tell me.
I mean, I just think that he should decide whether he's in entertainment or politics. And it seems to me that the Conservative Party's getting less and less interest in actually governing or doing the day job, so maybe they should call a general election and then they can all go off and be on I'm a Celebrity.
Well, I mean, he was not the first, of course, to do it. Nadine
Dorries, very famously,
had
but she became a cabinet minister after. He was a cabinet minister first.
Kezia Dugdale, of course, did it, leader of Labour in Scotland. I mean, people do mix these things up, don't they? I mean, in the sense of combine things. I mean, if I could just show you, Chris Mason, BBC's political editor, has this from Andy Drummond, Deputy Chairman of West Suffolk Conservative Association, tells PA, I'm looking forward to him eating a kangaroo's penis. Quote me. You can quote me on that. Stephen?
Well, that does reflect one subplot here, which is that Matt Hancock, I would say, does not seem to be in a very good place as far as his relationship with his Conservative Association is. Conservative members do have very broad powers of deselection, so he may live to regret his trip to the jungle. Now, look, I have a confession to make. I've never watched I'm a Celebrity.
I thought you were going to say you'd been on it and I'd missed it, Stephen.
Sadly, although if they're watching, call me. But, yeah, look, it doesn't seem to me obvious that you can combine the role of being an MP with going on I'm a Celebrity. It visibly makes the government look bad. I think it visibly not what... Yeah, if I wanted to talk to my MP about something, I would not want to be put through to a phone call saying, oh, sorry, Diane Abbott can't come to the phone right now, she's in Australia. I imagine people in West Suffolk feel the same. I think it's obviously... You know, I think it's the wrong thing to do by his party, the wrong thing to do by his constituents, and I imagine that if he does decide he wants to stand next time, then his association is probably going to have a thing or two to say about that.
And just to be clear, Kezia Dugdale, just to be fair to her, had left politics when she went on to it.
I mean, yes, I want Boy George to win. He's a real celebrity.
Right, well, we'll go through who we want to win, perhaps on another programme, since I can't remember who else is actually on the show. Stephen raises this issue about whether he might stand again. Is it really that he's thought politics, perhaps frontline, certainly, is over for him. Emily, I mean, he may have wanted to try and get back into the Rishi Sunak government, but obviously that hasn't happened, and that he's going to take his chances out in the jungle.
Yes, and he said he was going to run for the leader of the Treasury Select Committee, I believe, as well, which he stood down to. But he's also been on Celebrity SAS, so he obviously thinks he's got some kind of talent in the TV entertainment, but I'm not sure. I tweeted earlier that he might not be there for very long, but actually I'm thinking that with all the gruesome, what do they call them, tests, not tests, challenges that there are, eating, whatnot, he might be there for a little while.
Let's just show you the picture since we mentioned it. This was when Rishi Sunak being welcomed into Downing Street, being hugged by various colleagues, except for those eagle-eyed. He walks past Matt Hancock. Now, could have been an innocent reason, but it was generally reported as a snub. Do you think, Stephen, that was the last straw for Matt Hancock, thinking that perhaps I need to look elsewhere in terms of my future career?
No, I think, actually, in terms of the people he hugged his campaign managers. But I think, seeing as this is a government broadly of experienced ministers, and whatever one thinks of the political choices Matt Hancock has made, this is someone who has shown he could achieve in a delivery department. I think if he's not, he will have looked at this cabinet and gone, look, if I haven't got in this broad government of all of the party, my frontline career is over. So he probably has still, time to visit it's a jungle, right, still?
Yeah, it is. I'm very out of touch on this just keep you bang up to date there, Stephen. Rachel Wearmouth has tweeted this. Lobby Akinola of COVID Justice UK says the fact that Matt Hancock is trying to cash in on his terrible legacy rather than showing some humility or seeking to reflect on the appalling consequences of his time in government says it all about the sort of person he is. Is that fair, Miriam, or not?
No, I don't think it's fair. I think it's the wrong decision to go on I'm a Celebrity, but I'm not going to join in some sort of pile-on on Matt Hancock personally. And I think, you know, as much as people disagreed with some of the policies during COVID, and I was one of those people.
Yes.
He worked incredibly hard, non-stop during that time. And he came to my constituency and visited a GP's practice. He didn't have to, he was passing, he spared the time, came and thanked the doctors and nurses and the receptionists. Very well received. You know, whatever you think about his record in government, he worked incredibly hard during that period of time.
I mean, do you accept that, Angela, that it does look perhaps like a bit of a pile-on in that sense, to use Miriam's words? And there is an argument for politicians appearing on these kinds of shows if they make donations from their fees. Yes, you've said that he's going to raise the issue of the campaigning of dyslexia, donation to a local hospice in his constituency. Nadine Dorries donated her MP salary to charity while she appeared on the TV show.
I just remember George Galloway dressed as a cat.
Yeah, well, I think we'd all rather forget that.
I just don't see the point. Either go into entertainment or be a politician.
But in a way, there are still people writing books, giving after-dinner speeches. I mean, isn't this all part of Boris Johnson will no doubt be indulging in all those things?
I don't think it's the same as sort of organised sort of humiliation on a show in Australia. I mean, if he wants to be humiliated in that way, then that's fine, and I hope he enjoys the kangaroo penis.
Right, well, one final question. I bet you're all going to be watching, though. Are you going to be watching I'm a Celebrity as a result of Matt Hancock going to be on the show? Anybody? No. I don't believe you. I don't believe
you. Can't get the ITV hub on the PlayStation.
All right, don't talk about that.
So, you know,
anyway, that's all we have time for today on this very serious programme. But I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:15 for Rishi Sunak's second appearance at Prime Minister's Questions. That's here on BBC Two. Bye-bye.